Welcome to Coffee Break with Rachel V. Hill, presented by Superbook Sports. Taking a daily look at the biggest stories in Denver sports and interacting live with you, the Coffee Break fam. So sit back, relax, grab a cup of joe, and enjoy your coffee break. Here's your host, Rachel V. Hill.
Happy Tuesday, everybody. Welcome into Coffee Break. Richard Carney, Rachel V. Hill. It's officially cutdown day. Tuesday, Mountain Time at 2 p.m. is when the 53-man roster has to be announced by the Denver Broncos. Lots of moves are already happening. The biggest one coming out, and I feel like the one most people are freaking out about, is that the Broncos have released tight end Albert Okwuegbunam. I'm not shocked by this move at all, but I am surprised by the amount of people I'm seeing being like, oh my gosh, what's happening? I want to get your take on it first.
Yeah, so listen, we talked about it yesterday on Coffee Break. We both were kind of like leaning toward like you're still not going to keep him probably even after that great performance. But hey, man, he couldn't have done much more, I suppose, other than block better, because he did have a couple of missed blocks in that game despite having unbelievable receiving stats. And at the end of the day, that body of work just wasn't enough to overwrite all that has been written on Albert O thus far.
Here's my thing with it. First of all, a year ago, all of us were like, why is Albert O even on this team? He can't block. He's like, a defense will automatically know what's happening when it comes to Albert O. I get it, everybody. He had one really good game. But you know what? Adam Troutman, he wasn't out there. Greg Dulcich, he wasn't out there. Everybody take a breath. We wish Albert O the best. I'm sure he's going to sign on with another NFL team. But let's not freak out too much.
Yeah, and listen, the next team, because I don't think he'll clear waivers, especially with a performance like that. And I think the next team that brings him in is not going to ask him to block very much. They're going to understand this is his skill set, this is what he's good at, and we're going to put him in a position to succeed, which is what he needs. It just doesn't match what the Broncos and Sean Payton are trying to do this year.
No, 100%. And I am reading all of the comments. Lots of people, again, why would you cut Albert O? This roster is very limited. We're going to get into the Will Lutz situation here in just a little bit. But again, I'm curious to know, everybody in the comments, what's your thoughts on Albert O being released? Again, I'm just not surprised. And I think he kind of was a little bit of a liability, and I just don't look at it as like this absolutely must-have player on the roster when you have Adam Troutman, who obviously knows Sean Payton's offense, and Greg Dulcich and Albert O are kind of the same person, and I feel like you got to go with the younger one in that sense because they both have their struggles, which tends to be blocking, but hey, one of them is going to be a lot easier to get in that mindset, the younger one of like, here's how we're doing. We're changing this. And I just think you go with Greg Dulcich over at Albert O in that situation.
I think you do too. And I think Greg Dulcich is better than Albert O.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to argue with you there. Again, like I said yesterday, though, I understand the notion of, hey, this is a guy that clearly has a unique skill set. He is a mismatch in the open field. A linebacker, even at the NFL level, covering somebody with the skill set of Albert O, it has inklings of the same thing we see when you're trying to guard Travis Kelce, George Kittle, Mark Andrews, Kyle Pitts, some of the top tight ends in the league, Dallas Goedert. He presents those same physical skill sets. He's just not well-rounded enough to be able to balance that with the other side of the job responsibilities, which is being a force in the run game, setting the edge, and blocking well. And that's going to be the foundational element for this team. He just doesn't have enough to make it happen.
Here's another thing that I've been seeing a lot, both on Twitter or X, whichever one you want to call it, and now obviously in the comments. Oh, Albert O was being shopped. However, probably the Broncos couldn't trade him. Probably. I said yesterday on the show, he went into the fourth quarter because they really wanted to make him look shiny and good, and that's why in preseason game number 3. Now, it didn't work out, and a lot of people are like, I'm surprised you couldn't get anything for him, maybe even a 7th round. I'm not terribly surprised by this. Again, you can look at one good game and then quite a few bad games. But did you think they could get a 7th round pick for it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the trade market is so hard to evaluate because you can get anything for anybody as long as there's somebody willing to pay it. So I think in this situation, like Albert O, like you could have got, if they had gotten a 7th round pick or a conditional or a future whatever, I would have been like, okay, that makes sense. But at the same time, around this time of year with how many players getting cut around the league, teams, unless you're dying, you got to have him. You either know he's going to get claimed and you're not going to get it, or you can't, you feel like you can't move on without it. you'll just wait until and see if they get claimed.
Yep. Reading more comments, I'm not surprised at all. He was facing the third string defense for the Rams.
True.
Yeah, like I said, Adam Troutman wasn't out there, and Greg Dulcich wasn't out there, so Alberto
so was
looked,
everybody else, though. So everybody else in that game was facing the second string, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
Marvin Mims had a great game, and we're not going, he was against the backups.
But he looked good because those two other guys weren't out there. I'm not saying that like the plays he did weren't fantastic, but when you put maybe an Adam Troutman or even a Greg Dulcich, you might be like, all right, well, Alberto doesn't look as good, and that's kind of what we saw in training camp a lot of.
Yeah, I mean, you could put a Greg Dulcich out there. I don't think Alberto did anything in that game that Greg Dulcich couldn't have done if given the same opportunity. And there actually was a moment, again, we talked about the missed blocks. There was a moment on one of his long catches down the far sideline where he actually cut away from some lead blockers, and that's when he hurdled the guy. Like, you could argue that a better tight end or a more, heads-up tight end would have cut inside and followed those blockers and maybe got more yards. But I don't think the question is, hey, if you put an Adam Troutman or a Greg Dulcich in, they're doing the same thing. What it really is could a Nate Atkins have done the same thing? Could a Chris Manhertz have done the same thing? And the answer to that is probably no.
It's an interesting question to be.
Chris Manhertz is the opposite of Alberto. He's like solely a blocker. He's almost no threat, if not a liability in the passing game for the most part. But he has comfortability with Sean Payton, and he can block. And that's clearly what Sean Payton wants. So when forced to pick between two extremes, the guy who can't block at all but is a mismatch in the receiving game, and the guy that can only block, Sean Payton's going to take the guy that can only block. And that's why it just was never going to work.
For sure. Hey, guys, this is a rough day. It is. We talked about this a little bit yesterday on Coffee Break. It's a sad day. A lot of people are losing their jobs. A lot of people are excited because it's closer to football, but it still is definitely a tough day. Reading more questions. Let's see. Oh, I'm seeing quite a few things come in about the GM, which is actually kind of interesting for me as well. I didn't like the George Payton hire from the start. Tell me what Minnesota's done in the last 20. And then somebody said we need to cut the GM. How would you evaluate what George Payton has done thus far?
I think that George Payton has hit on a couple of his bigger high-round picks, Pat Surtain being the marquee there.
Give me, though.
I got it. You can make the argument that everybody, when you're picking in the top 10, should be able to pick between the 10 best players in college football. But it doesn't always happen. I mean, whiffs happen in the top 10 in the draft all the time. Most notably, it feels like they're at quarterback because that's the one that has the most risk behind it.
Yep.
But it does happen. I mean, Jadeveon Clowney was drafted in the top 3 of the draft, and he didn't amount to being a top 3 draft pick. And so that's an edge rusher kind of thing. So I think that George Payton has hit on a handful of picks, a couple at the top, a couple throughout the whole draft. But I do think that, we saw Alberto, we saw Montreal Washington these were other picks from George Payton's more recent classes that Sean Payton is essentially showing the door. So I do think that's an indictment on George and how his skill set is being perceived in the new regime versus how it was before.
For sure. DenverSports.com has an updated cuts list as well. Here's what we've got as the show had just begun, obviously. And there's quite a few names that I think are kind of interesting. Faion Hicks obviously was a draft pick last year. You've got Delarian Turner.
Delarian Turner.
Yeah. I believe he got cut too. And then, of course, some other notable names with Kendall Hinton, Christopher Allen's on there, Montreal Washington, excuse me. I said it's Montreal Washington
I
who
was
I'm
gonna
thinking
say.
of. And then the other one that everybody is going off about is because there's a new kicker in town. Now, this had been rumored about Will Lutz, but it was official. The Broncos decided to trade for him.
Just when you thought that Kickergate might have seen a solution, nope. And
I could not believe the amount of people that thought that Brett Maher was going to be the kicker for the Denver Broncos. I said from the get-go, the kicker for the Denver Broncos is not going to be on this team.
There is a part of me that thinks that this was just kind of Sean Payton's plan all along. He may have known whether it was specifically Will Lutz, because they have a history together. Will Lutz was like one of the few kickers in the Sean Payton era that stuck for multiple years. I mean, that was a revolving door in New Orleans for the most part, except for when Will Lutz was there. So there's a part of me that thought like, hey, knowing what he knows about the organization, the team, about Will and the contracts and all of that, he may have been in a situation where he just said, "Hey, I think they're going to dump this guy.
Yeah.
I'll keep bodies in here. I'll keep it fresh. And the second he becomes available, he's mine." And he traded for him. So they didn't even wait for that. But I mean, there were other kickers that lost battles across the league. Dustin Hopkins lost it to Cameron Dicker in Los Angeles. And so I could see Sean Payton, who's been clear that he doesn't really stress about who's kicking for him, could have just been like, by cutdown day, there's going to be a lot of names out there. I'm just going to pluck one. And if I find somebody before that, great.
Listen, and if I've learned anything about Sean Payton in the few couple of months that I've been able to cover him, is that he knows exactly what he wants, and he's going to tell you exactly what he wants in a way that he's not going to tell you what he wants. He knew that the kicker was not going to be on the team when he was like, he's being compared to the 31 other teams in the NFL, and there's a lot of other things.
Maybe he's on the roster. Maybe he's not. I don't know.
Sean Payton will 100% tell you what he wants without actually telling you what he wants. And as soon as he was I think there was 2 press conferences that he was like, they're just competing against other guys on the roster. I'm like, all right, Sean Payton. So you're telling me Brett Maher is not your guy, clearly.
Right. He couldn't have been asked to give a vote of confidence and not given that vote of confidence any more than he has this offseason. Compared to any other position, he was just so non-committal about the kicker that it always felt like this kind of move was right under the surface.
It's definitely interesting. Seeing a lot of people being like, we're lucky to have him. He's a great coach. Sean Payton taking control 100%. And did Sean Payton take control of what we've seen today? A lot of people are like, oh, George Payton coming in. This is his time to shine. Was it George Payton or was it actually Sean Payton who came in and said, these are the guys I want. These are the guys we're keeping. George, you can make the calls.
In today's NFL, I do think that there are plenty of reasonable examples as to the coach superseding the organizational chart in terms of like, this is your boss, this is your boss, this is your boss. The GM, theoretically, is a front office person over the head coach, is involved in the hiring process of the head coach. But in today's NFL, because a premier head coach is becoming a rarer and rarer commodity, the hiring of a premier head coach, of which Sean Payton is, in my opinion, and I would believe in the opinion of a lot of others, supersedes that org chart. So I do think Sean Payton has final say on a lot of things. I don't want to make it can be fun. I've definitely joked around that, like, George Payton's memorized Sean Payton's coffee order kind of thing. It's fun to like joke around. George Payton has influence and sway in the decision making that goes on in there, but I think it's a much lesser degree.
Sean Payton has the final say.
I agree.
And it just feels that way when you're even out at Broncos facility, right? Like last year, and I know people don't like having the comparison because last year was a disaster. Nathaniel Hackett just did not have his best coaching appearance, we could say that way. But we saw a lot more of George Payton. I think one day I saw George Payton.
I've seen Damani Leach 10 times more than I've seen Sean Payton.
Way more. Damani Leach likes to talk to people, that's for sure. He is always out there chatting it up.
I feel like we're going to get along.
Richie's like, let's sit down and have a cup of coffee. Tell me about the plans for the stadium, why don't you?
Yeah, let's just, spin a little yarn here, Damani. Let's,
Let us know who in the comments who you are most surprised is not making this team, the 53-man roster. Of course, new names are coming in. It's till 2 p.m. Mountain Time today, 4 p.m. Eastern, that names are going to continue to show up. We're going to be updating you guys. I've got the group text going. Everybody's letting us know who's going to be making it.
All of our phones are like faced up, ready to go.
Right, seriously. Is Alberto the most surprising name that you've seen?
No.
Who was most surprising? I'm curious.
That's a good question. I feel like he qualifies in the most surprising category because it wasn't just the last preseason game. He had a really good joint practice day. He scored 4 touchdowns in the 2 joint practice days, and that was kind of the precursor leading up to that game. So I guess he could qualify in the most surprising category. But it just wasn't super surprising to me because I just didn't think they were going to keep him. So I guess that's probably a bad answer to your question because I don't know that there was any that were like, oh my gosh, surprising. I guess maybe Brett Maher kind of qualifies in that category too because, again, we like we just explained and all that. But he had to make a trade for that to happen, which means you had to have another team agree to it, and there's moving parts there. So it's probably between Alberto and Brett Maher.
Yeah, I think Alberto was the one where it was just like, oh, I didn't expect it to happen this early on. I was also surprised that they didn't cut anybody yesterday. it was very silent out of Broncos headquarters, but I was looking and paying attention to other teams in the NFL, and like the Chiefs didn't cut anybody yesterday. So I'm like, these clearly had to be some hard decisions. Otherwise, you would just be like, all right, because they did some on Sunday, right? Like we saw Kendall Hinton get cut on Sunday, and it was just like boom, 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 boom.
Yep, and I think that's probably an indication that the Broncos, along with a lot of other teams, were going to take the amount of time that they had allotted to them to really hammer down who it's going to be.
Or was it they're all trying to be like a little tricky here of like, oh, we're not gonna let you know who we're cutting because we don't want you to cut somebody and then
true.
One of our
like
guys.
The more people you cut and the more people we know who's available could influence our decisions.
I think it's a little sneaky.
I'll give you another one that just I guess again, none of them were like made me like spill my coffee like oh my gosh, but Tyler Lancaster getting cut, that was an interesting one for me because I think on that defensive front there, he had shown some good things, and that's just another testament to the situation that these guys are in. I mean, Tyler Lancaster and some of these other guys, they had to walk out of that preseason game being like, I played pretty good, like I'm gonna get on the bus, I'm gonna do my thing, and like I think I did enough, and then like 24 or 48 hours later, it's like, nope, guess you didn't, and you have no probably communication between then.
Yeah. Another cut just coming out is our Broncos cornerback Kyle Fuller.
The offensive lineman.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Offensive lineman?
Mm-hmm.
Fuller?
Mm-hmm.
Why am I thinking cornerback?
Because we did have a cornerback here named Kyle Fuller, but it's different.
Richie's keeping me on track this morning. Lots of names are coming through.
No, but we were talking about this because like when you have guys that have the same name as before
it does get tricky.
and the same numbers as guys who were just here the last year, it is weird. Like watching Samaje Perine run out there in number 25.
For sure.
Melvin Gordon's number or Malik Reed,
you're right. And
Bradley
they're both
Chubb.
Kyle, or they're both Kyle.
That's spelled the exact same.
Yep.
Yeah, it's one of those like double take ones.
Yep. Okay.
But he was an interior offensive lineman, I believe.
Yeah. He's gone now. I'll throw back up the list too if there's some other names. Here we go. Wide receiver, a lot of people are like, well, with Jerry Jeudy going to be out for a little bit, you get rid of Taylor Grimes, obviously Kendall Hinton, Josh Hammond.
Montreal Washington. Yeah, you're thinning out that room, and that tells you one of two things. Either they're preparing and they're comfortable with running light at that position.
Which can they be?
Or Sean Payton just says, hey, I'm gonna look around the league and we're gonna claim some guys on waivers, we're gonna pick up some guys that clear, and we're gonna go that route.
Which, not to be disrespectful to anybody in the Broncos wide receiver room, but besides the big names, there's nobody that really sticks out. So it's like you could probably look around the league and maybe find a few quote unquote bigger names or just some people that have had a little bit more experience.
We're probably looking at, depending on Jerry Jeudy's situation, we're probably looking at like your starting wide receiver duo being Cortland Sutton and Brandon Johnson.
Yeah.
And Brandon Johnson was a name that we were kind of like, we obviously knew who he was and all that, but I don't think any of us a month ago were looking at this team being like, oh, Brandon Johnson's going to start the year at number 2.
Yeah.
Like,
some other news coming out that Ian Rappaport just put out. The Arizona Cardinals are waiving Rashard Lawrence. He was their starting nose tackle during the last few seasons in Vance Joseph's defense. He's now obviously with the Broncos as the defensive coordinator. So a name to definitely be on the lookout for.
Yeah, the NFL is in many ways the epitome of the old boys club. You have coaches that are familiar with other coaches and they bring them in. And we saw Gary Kubiak bring his gaggle of assistant coaches with him everywhere he went. Sean Payton brought in Joe Lombardi, who he has connections with as a quarterback's coach and all of that. And that applies to players too. I mean, on the defensive side of the ball, the crown jewel was Vance Joseph's former defensive lineman. You know what I mean? So it would not surprise me if they didn't at least kick those tires, given the connections to that specific coaching group.
So many of the relationships, like it really does matter the relationship you have between player and coach. And so if they already know the system, right, and they can fit into that scheme, I feel like that's when you see a lot of names. And if Ian Rappaport is putting it out there, that means that there is already some connection there that's like, oh, well, we're showing maybe a little bit of interest.
It's the opposite effect of, when you have a new coach who's putting in a new system on a new team, players like that are paramount. I mean, we talked to Zach Allen earlier this year, and he said that a lot of his teammates and his position mates were coming up to him, asking him for insight and clarification on how to run some of the things that VJ is putting out there. So the more players you can bring in, like this isn't like having a system in place and you're confident and you bring in a new person that's like a new star player and say, hey, between me and the rest of the players, I as a coach can teach him to do it. This is the opposite.
Yeah, no, true. I'm seeing a lot of people going in the comments about the wide receivers. I love it. Keep it coming. What about Mims? He can probably move up the chart for sure. Marvin Mims has showed a lot of potential.
He can ball.
But he's still very young. And now with Jerry Jeudy, I've heard a lot of people say week 1 he should be back. I don't think that's going to happen. I would be surprised if he's back by week 3 or week 4. But again, week 3 is Miami. Could you imagine you're coming back from a hamstring injury? You haven't really been able to work out to your full potential, and then you go down to the hot and humid Miami. That can lead to cramps or any sort of nature for you to possibly get hurt. So I don't love him coming back week 3. I am seeing lots of people. Somebody said we could have had Odell and D-Hop as DeAndre or Hopkins.
Yeah, you would have had to pay him
big bucks.
Yeah,
right
you would
there.
have had to pay him. And they're already. I mean, were we not already chastising them for having the highest paid wide receiver room in the NFL? And there's like 1,000-yard season combined between all of them.
It's
so you're talking about like a Pro Bowl and a 1,000-yard season collectively among the most expensive wide receiver room in the NFL. I would have. I mean, listen. I think anybody would say I would love to see DeAndre Hopkins. Catching passes from Russell Wilson this season. He's one of the premier talents at that position, and he's still kind of an alpha number 1 option, despite the turmoil that he's seen in the last few years from team to team to team. You just can't afford to do everything you want to do.
No, for sure. I see some people asking to see the list again. Obviously, the one name we don't have on this list because it hasn't been updated is Kyle Fuller in there as well. So cutdown day continues. The other one I guess we haven't even got to, which is surprising to me, is Ben DiNucci got cut. So the Broncos are running with 2 quarterbacks.
My guess is yes, that they're going to cut DiNucci. They're going to expect him probably to clear waivers and then bring him back on the practice squad, and he will be that third option.
But did he do enough? Or do you think Sean Payton will look around for another one?
I think Sean Payton has a wandering eye. I think Sean Payton is always going to look around. But I do think that Ben DiNucci probably did enough, given the fact that we're just talking about picking him up as a practice squad body.
Yeah.
I think he probably did enough during training camp and these preseason games to warrant that.
I love this. DiNucci. I absolutely love that. I think that's so funny.
I don't think we mentioned it. How bizarre it was in that last preseason game that on Ben DiNucci's jersey,
yes,
the I, because it's capital D, lowercase I, capital N. But the I, the little I between the D and the N on his jersey was just like a little baby number 1.
Yeah.
Like, okay, the issue.
This is gonna bother Richie for the rest of
the
the
misspelling on the jersey, that we saw in the preseason games. Like, again, and I even said, I was like, hey, there's probably a lot that goes on there. But, like, you're telling me that this $6 billion organization didn't have the right little lettering to put it on? We had to put a number 1? I don't know that that's...
He doesn't even get a little dot.
Yes. Yeah, I don't know that I've never seen that. I've never seen a number used as... That's like a license plate thing.
Yeah, but it makes me wonder because...
McLaughlin, that's just like a misspelling.
But they fixed that, and DiNucci had it for all 3 games.
Is he gonna, okay, let's just say, hypothetically speaking, he, like, the worst thing happens ever for the Broncos, and Russell Wilson goes down, Jarrett Stidham goes down, and we are starting Ben DiNucci at quarterback, and he doesn't even have all letters on the back of his, like, is that what we're looking at?
But I'm kind of wondering if maybe that's how he wanted it. Because again, the NFL, the Broncos fixed McLaughlin's when they added the G in there. It's just an L. And they didn't fix that for Ben DiNucci at all. So I'm kind of wondering if that was like by design.
Now I'm going to go back on like NFL Game Pass. I'm going to like look at the earlier preseason games and see if that was a one or if that was like a one-off, because something had to give there. And I don't know, like, I feel like that's probably a thing where they reasonably think like, nobody's going to really notice, but I noticed. Okay.
She's like, listen, I got those eyes.
I saw, we were sitting in the press box. I'm like, what the hell is that? What is, like, because they showed him on that massive big screen.
It is huge. Also, there is practice today starting at noon, and George Payton is planning to talk around 2 p.m., I believe. So we're all kind of essentially assuming that all of these moves are going to be done by noon, which is obviously in just over a little bit of an hour.
Yeah, presser will be at 2 o'clock Mountain, I believe. So no Damani Leach. Huh? He's occupied.
Man, today it wasn't his job. Though I'm sure they'll throw something with the stadium at us here in a little bit. But yes, it will be interesting to hear from George Payton. But knowing that Sean Payton will be out at practice makes me think, all right, most of the big names will be done. Because Sean Payton did say that he likes to talk to each and every player as they come in and, wish them their farewells.
So many conversations. I mean, like, I think that like any of us that are in an office setting, in a work setting, have been on at least one side of those uncomfortable conversations, and they're hard. Now imagine having to do 20 of them over the course of like 3 days, and there really just isn't a way to sugarcoat that news. Like, you might be ending someone's dream.
Yeah, and essentially if you're a player and you get that phone call, you just know, and that has to be so hard to be able to like, all right, I'm going in, everybody.
Yeah, you just killed yourself for a couple of months to try to like make a spot, and you just missed the cut, and now you've got to try to like amp yourself up and convince another one of the 31 teams that you can do the exact same thing, except you don't have an audition period really to do it. Yeah, it's tough.
Somebody said good eyes on the DiNucci.
Always watching.
And I do feel more confident seeing Jared Stidham out there to be the backup QB for Russell Wilson after how he played against the Rams.
Got some wheels.
He's got some wheels, and it was one of those moments where I was like, all right, Sean, I see what you like out of this quarterback.
Yeah, I was not expecting him to like that play specifically where he took off and run. That would have been one of those moves you're like sack. Whoa, it was one of those. It's like when an NBA not an NBA, but like when Michael Porter Jr. jacks up like a 37-foot three-pointer, and you're like, come on, what are you? Oh, it went in.
Oh, okay.
That was like a sack. Wait a second. And then he just took off.
I like it. I'm also curious because I keep seeing a lot of comments, and I saw actually a lot on Twitter. People are thinking Albert O is just going to be headed to the Chiefs. Is this just something that we're all worried about because it's a name we know and we don't want to see him go to the Chiefs? Like,
no, I'm not saying, I'm not predicting that it's going to happen. But if it did happen, it would be one of the most like, of course, things ever, because the Chiefs are operating from such a position of leverage that they have such a well-oiled machine on offense. They can afford to take flyers, whether it's on waivers or whether it's, trading late round picks or whatever it is, signing guys for vet minimums, because they have Patrick freaking Mahomes. And I would bet, because the Chiefs have the offense that they have, if Albert O goes to Kansas City, that dude is dropping a serious touchdown on the Broncos' head this season. It'll happen. It'll just happen, because Andy Reid is a mastermind at using the skill sets of his players, and I think he would make a weapon for them.
We're just going to look up the Chiefs tight end room real quick. I'm obviously not familiar with it besides Travis Kelce, who's just an unbelievable player. Because I'm not so sold. Do you know who Noah Gray is?
I mean, I know of him because he's been with the Chiefs for a little while. Okay. So, like, I know of him, but I wouldn't say that I could break down his skill set for you.
Blake Bell.
Nope.
What about Matt Bushman?
Nope.
Okay, well, there's two names on there. I don't know why the Chiefs would go Albert Okwuegbunam. You struggled all last season. You kind of struggled up until the final preseason game.
You struggled with that awful, dysfunctional Denver Broncos team that doesn't have their house in order, but you can come here where we've got a maid.
Where we're going to win a championship. Let's be honest. Albert O was brought in to be Drew Lock's just gimme guy.
Yep, his college teammate.
Drew Lock didn't work out.
And Albert O at the Combine was kind of a freak. I think he had the fastest, if not like up toward the fastest 40 times. Yeah. He displayed some of that mismatch athleticism.
He had 14 or 17 touchdowns his senior season in college. So, like, he's a freak. He knows how to do it.
I mean, he's a mismatch as a tight end at the NFL level in the open field. Imagine in college.
But you have to be able to have a different skill set. You're just not as dynamic.
It's all about fit.
It is.
He doesn't fit this Broncos team. But again, to the comments credit, he could fit a Chiefs skill set where they might just line him out wide like a slot receiver and say, okay, cornerback X, go ahead, give it your best shot.
Can he, though?
I think he can. What else besides blocking was the major issue? And it was a big issue. That's why he got cut. What if the team doesn't? I do think the team that picks him up won't need him to block. What if the Chiefs don't need him to block?
But you want
Travis
somebody
Kelce can
who
block.
Is dynamic. You don't just need somebody who, when they go out there, you're like, oh, well, they're going to get the ball.
You need that if he's your starting tight end. This may be like a back end of the roster, kind of like they may just the Chiefs. We saw in that quarterback documentary, the Chiefs players just come up with plays and formations and packages on their own.
Fun.
You're telling me with how brilliant I believe Patrick Mahomes is and all of that if Albert O was in that tight end room with the physical mismatch that he presents, we were talking here about a Greg Dulcich, Albert O, Tiger package. We're putting them both out on the field at the same time to create these mismatches because you can barely cover one. It's really hard to cover both. You're telling me that Patrick Mahomes might not look at Travis Kelce and Albert O and be like, I could work with this.
I don't like it. Let's hope it doesn't happen.
I don't want it to happen either, but this is what happens when you decide to let someone like that out of your room. You have to be okay. You can't break up with a girl and then have her get back together with somebody and be like, hang on now. I'm not supposed to be unhappy if you're happy.
Are you talking from experience?
Maybe.
On that note, as we'll get into Richie's dating life, we'll do that on the next episode of Coffee Break. Obviously, still a little over or a little under an hour at this point of names probably left to be dropped, but they do have until 2 p.m., which we will hear from George Payton. DenverSports.com will have you guys updated on absolutely everything that you need to know. Thank you so much for hanging out with us for the last 30 minutes. We loved all of your comments and so great to see so many of you. We'll be back 10:30 tomorrow morning. Get back to work, everybody. We'll see you then. Bye.